The New York Times is reporting from an unnamed DoD official that they are viewing Russia and Turkey as a greater threat to troop security than ISIS in Syria. The report goes on to explain that it's not really the actual military forces of Turkey or Russia that they're concerned about, rather the armed militias who have their backing. So with a lack of command and direction on what to do in Syria following the withdrawal of some 1,000 U.S. troops, remaining soldiers remaining on the ground to combat pockets of ISIS still holding out in the region. So for more on this, let's talk to former Pentagon official Mike Maloof. Okay, Mike, so first off, what do you make of this New York Times story? Are these Russian and Turkish-backed groups really a huge threat to American soldiers in Syria?
From my sources, the indication is that seems to be the greater concern right now, that these Salafist militant groups, which they support in some cases, and particularly with the Turks, could launch raids from the Syrian side. It could be the PMU, the Popular Mobilization Units, Shia out of Iraq. And they're allowed to come go back and forth into Syria. And you're talking about a limited number of U.S. troops in a highly isolated area.
Yeah.
So the ability to get backup is questionable and certainly will take time. You got to recall that their base was attacked by the Wagner group some 6 months, within the last 6 months. I forgot the exact dates, but and some 200 of those personnel were killed, and they were trying to hit. And there's some indication that there may be further attempts. Lastly, you got to keep in mind that Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, has already said, look, that their occupation is not going to become another Iraq.
Right.
And he's insisting that he wants that territory back, which is his land, his oil. And the U.S. never was invited there, and yet the U.S. is pumping the oil and selling it.
So allegedly, they also say the Russian military is much better at managing these outside groups and coordinating with the U.S., but this unnamed DoD official criticized Turkey's poor management. In your experience, do you believe that to be true about the Turks?
The Turkish military is highly disciplined, but when you're working with groups, and there was an incident very recently in which a group under Turkish control began to bombard areas very near U.S. soldiers. And that's one of the reasons why they left. Now, one of the things I think that is suggested here is that because Trump got the troops out when the Turks moved in, I think what they're thinking of is maybe, well, let's just do another raid. Maybe that might prompt Trump to say, okay, I'm taking my guys out of there because I don't want to further combat. I don't want to
spook them out.
Yeah, spook them out. I don't want to have to complicate relations with the Turks or with the Russians. I wouldn't take that chance, but at the same time, you can't rule it out.
So General Kenneth McKenzie, the boss at CENTCOM, recently said that the bigger challenge in protecting those oil fields that you mentioned might actually come from the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, in that he seems unsure of how effective those guys might be against fighting ISIS. So let me ask you this. Is that an indication of the U.S. failure to properly train and arm these guys, or is it a sign of something else?
I think it's just the SDS has been very effective in fighting ISIS. They were our boots on the ground fighting ISIS. I think McKenzie is just attempting to justify the continued presence of U.S. troops there because the SDF with U.S. support has been very effective.
Yeah, I was very confused by that comment because they were, fighting for U.S. I guess for lack of better description, on the U.S. side, if you will, in this fight.
Well, we're fighting on their side, yeah.
Or that, but for him to make that kind of comment seemed a little.
Well, I think it was
shocking.
a backhanded way of saying we need to stay here.
Yeah.
And justify fighting
Yeah, it sounds
ISIS,
like
because that it continues to be the mantra as to why, the narrative as to why U.S. presence is there illegally.
Yes.
But there's been no explanation as to why they're sucking the oil and selling it.
But he's also discrediting friends of the U.S. at that point. But, you know, we'll leave that to his discretion.
Yeah, right.
One more thing I want to talk about is Libya and Turkey. Turkey, you know, upset about how Libya is all destabilized and that the U.S. has done that. And so they said, well, we want to go in. Should they? Why do they want to go in?
Well, if they want to, it's part of Erdogan's desire to spread his influence throughout the region. Now, he supports the government of Tripoli. He does not support Haftar, which the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, UAE, all have begun to show their support to, including Russia. So, for him to then take the side of Tripoli, which is basically faltering, it's just his way of getting into the mix and trying to spread his influence. I think at the end of the day, it's not going to go anywhere. Because it also puts him up against the Saudis, and the Saudis and the Turks historically have had animosity toward each other. So I think he should be careful and focus on Syria right now, and
one battle at a time.
Yeah, and deal with Qatar and all the others. Qatar also supports Haftar.
Oh boy, that's a lot of big names behind Haftar.
So we have a lot of again moving parts to this equation.
Yeah, Mike, when we talk about the Middle East, there are always 1,000 moving parts to every one story. So we could designate a whole show for that.
Of course.
Between you and I and of course, our friend Jim Jatras.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Mike Maloof.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.